On the island of Capri, Emperor Tiberius built a paradise that turned into a prison of flesh. Historians recorded children trained for his pleasure, senators killed for whispering, and Rome frozen in fear. For 23 years he ruled through silence, terror, and unspoken crimes. This is not fiction. These are the darkest pages of Roman history. What happens when an empire obeys and dares not look away? Tiberius Claudius Nero was not born to rule. He was born into obligation, into silence, into a family where power mattered more than love, and obedience was the only language understood. His birth in 42 BCE was not greeted with prophecy or promise, only with the cold shadow of Rome's ambitions looming above his cradle. His mother, Livia Drusilla, was a woman of steel ambition and sharp calculation who divorced his father to marry Octavian, the future Augustus, while Tiberius was still a boy barely old enough to speak. From the beginning, Tiberius did not belong, not to his biological father, not to his mother who abandoned her marriage, and certainly not to Augustus, who never saw in him a son, only a tool, a placeholder, a pawn with patrician blood and a silent demeanour. He was tall, pale, introspective. He preferred the company of scrolls and shadows to the clamorous politics of the Forum. In another life he might have been a philosopher or a recluse lost in poetry and silence. But Rome did not make space for those kinds of men. Instead, he was shaped into something he was never meant to become. Livia, relentless in her ambitions, pushed her son into every corner of Roman politics, sowing alliances through arranged marriages and forced gestures. She offered him as a son to Augustus, though Augustus already had grandsons of his own. She tore him from the arms of Vipsania, the only woman he ever seemed to love, and ordered him to marry Julia, the emperor's daughter, who loathed him with the coldness of privilege and the cruelty of expectation. The pain of that forced divorce lingered in Tiberius's eyes long after the wedding had passed, long after the first son was born, and long after Julia's open affairs turned their marriage into a public humiliation. He never forgave Augustus for it, nor his mother, nor himself. At the age of 19, he learned the first law of survival in Rome's imperial cage. You do not speak, you endure, and if you wish to live, you become invisible even to your own grief. Behind closed doors, he was quiet. In the Senate, he was awkward. In war, he was effective. That was the puzzle of Tiberius, a man who hated being seen yet kept rising where eyes watched most. He had no desire for crowds, no charm for the people, no gift for performance. Yet the empire pushed him forward again and again, like a silent piece on a game board that refused to stop moving. It wasn't love that elevated him. It was necessity. Rome needed someone competent, controllable, and connected to Augustus. Tiberius was all three, but competence is not affection, and control is not trust. He fought Rome's battles because he had to, not because he wanted glory. He led legions across the Alps and into Germania, facing tribal resistance and brutal weather with the quiet precision of a soldier who understood that success meant delay from court, from manipulation, from the family that used him like a blade they never intended to sheath. When he returned, Rome cheered for him. But Augustus didn't. Despite victories that secured borders and restored stability, Augustus withheld the ultimate prize, naming him as heir, and instead promoted his own grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, grooming them publicly as the future of Rome. Tiberius, fully aware of his expendability, requested permission to retire, and in a move that shocked the public and delighted the court, Augustus allowed it. Tiberius sailed to Rhodes not in exile, but in retreat. He wandered the island like a ghost, avoiding embassies and audiences, dressed in simple robes, declining every invitation with the polite bitterness of a man already half buried. He taught philosophy. He walked alone. He was laughed at by senators back home and ignored by courtiers who believed his story had ended. But Rome is a machine that consumes its sons, and destiny has a cruel memory. Years later, when Gaius and Lucius both died unexpectedly, and one from illness, the other from accident, Augustus turned to the only surviving adult male with imperial blood and military success. And so Tiberius was summoned home. He did not smile when he returned. He did not forget the years of humiliation or the coldness of his mother's ambition or the bitterness of watching his beloved Vipsania taken from him. He obeyed, as he always had, because in Rome the most dangerous men were never the loudest. They were the ones who remembered. Tiberius never asked for glory, but glory arrived anyway, disguised as obligation, wrapped in imperial expectation and sealed with the cold approval of a stepfather who never loved him. Though his heart ached for silence and retreat, Rome demanded conquest, and so he went to war. He wore the armour of a soldier, not with pride but with resignation, as if each strap reminded him not of triumph but of the chains that bound him to a destiny he never chose. He was meticulous in planning, tireless in execution, and brutal when required. His legions respected him, not because he inspired joy or fire like Julius Caesar, but because he understood war not as theatre, but as necessity. He brought discipline, he brought order, he brought results. In the unforgiving passes of the Alps, he subdued rebellious tribes not with reckless charges, but with calculated attrition. He starved them into surrender, marched through snow with a grim stillness, and returned without flourish. Later in Germania, he did what many before him had failed to do. He built bridges across the Rhine, fortified supply lines, and avoided disasters through sheer relentless patience. Even in Parthia and Armenia, where politics bled into battlefields, Tiberius managed to secure Rome's influence without descending into reckless war. He was a general who understood that survival was sometimes more powerful than spectacle. Yet for every success carved in blood and stone, he received only silence. Augustus remained aloof, coldly praising him in public while grooming others in private. The victories of Tiberius were whispered in Senate halls but never celebrated in marble. There were no triumphal arches, no songs, no laurel crowns, just duty fulfilled, and then ignored. This quiet rejection, more than any battlefield, carved wounds into the soul of the reluctant general. In 6 BCE, exhausted by hypocrisy, broken by the forced marriage to Julia and suffocating under the weight of a court that treated him like a useful ghost, Tiberius did the unthinkable. He asked to leave. He begged for permission to retire from politics, to step away from the web of obligations and deceit, and to vanish into the quietude of Rhodes, a distant island removed from Rome's choking embrace. And Augustus, perhaps believing he had enough heirs in his lineage, granted it. Rhodes became Tiberius's quiet rebellion, not a retreat of weakness, but a deliberate act of rejection. He lived there not as an emperor in waiting, but as a private man. He refused guards, he denied audiences. He walked the streets alone, earning the curiosity of the Greeks and the disdain of Romans who saw his withdrawal as cowardice. But Rhodes was not peace, it was purgatory. He watched from afar as Gaius and Lucius, the emperor's golden grandsons, rose in fame and fortune. He watched the Senate mock his retreat. He listened to whispers that called him irrelevant, unwanted, forgotten. And then the world shifted. Gaius died in 4 CE, wounded and weakened by rebellion in Armenia. Lucius, only a year earlier, had perished on his way to Hispania. 2 deaths so close, so convenient, that even ancient historians could not help but murmur suspicions. Was it illness, or were darker forces at play? Livia, ever the strategist, seized the moment. She convinced Augustus, aging, increasingly frail, that Rome's survival demanded someone seasoned, someone capable, someone already proven. Tiberius, who had not asked for war or empire or marriage to Julia, now found himself recalled, not with celebration, not with parades, but with resignation. He returned from Rhodes with no ambition in his eyes, no joy in his step, only the weight of inevitability pressing against his ribs. Augustus adopted him formally, naming him heir. Yet even then he could not give fully. He forced Tiberius to adopt Germanicus, another of his grandsons, to ensure the dynasty remained tied to Augustus's blood. The message was clear: you may rule, but your name dies with you. Tiberius accepted. What choice did he have? The Senate applauded. The people watched. And behind every smile, every laurel, every proclamation, Tiberius felt the quiet sting of being Rome's second choice. The general called back not out of love, but out of necessity. And so, the man who once marched across continents now marched toward the throne, not in triumph, not in joy, but because fate refused to let him disappear. In the year 14 CE, as Augustus, the man who shaped an empire from a republic, exhaled his final breath in Nola, the air across Rome did not tremble with celebration. There were no chariots thundering down the Via Sacra, no crowds chanting in triumph, no songs composed for the ascension of a new god. Instead, there was hesitation, whispers, suspicion, a waiting silence as thick as marble dust in the forum. Tiberius had become emperor, but Rome, it seemed, was unsure whether it should cheer or shudder. His rise was not a coronation, but a consequence. There was no triumphal procession, no golden statue unveiled, no public embrace of the people's will. Even the Senate, ever eager to flatter the dead and exalt the living, hesitated in declaring Tiberius their princeps. And Tiberius, ever the enigma, responded with calculated distance, as if the throne itself was cursed, as if power were a weight he carried reluctantly, or worse, a punishment he had finally stopped fleeing. He refused overt titles. He declined excessive honours. When senators offered to call him Pater Patriae, father of the country, he evaded the gesture with the uncomfortable coldness of a man who had seen what such names could cost. And so began a reign not of celebration, but of retreat. Tiberius did not rule from the heart of Rome. He ruled from its margins. He appeared rarely in the forum. He held audiences in private chambers. He delegated public speeches to others, letting his voice echo not from his own mouth, but through the mouths of subordinates, scribes, and shadows. The man who had once commanded legions with clarity now governed an empire with ambiguity, a ruler half seen, half silent, half feared. And in the void he left behind, the knives began to flash. One of the first to die was Posthumus Agrippa, the banished grandson of Augustus, strong, erratic, and once considered an heir. Days after Augustus's death, Posthumus was executed without trial, without ceremony, without explanation. Officially, it was to prevent instability. Unofficially, it was a message. There would be no rivals. From that moment, the pattern emerged, cold and precise. Those who stood too close to the imperial lineage, those who remembered too much of the Republic, those who had once held favour under Augustus, one by one, they were removed. Not with the spectacle of public assassinations or bloody coups, but with the slow suffocation of legal procedure, forced suicides and silent disappearances. Tiberius governed through others, but the blood still stained his shadow. He let the Senate believe they had power. He allowed them to vote, to debate, to draft decrees, but behind the curtain he held the strings. He watched, he remembered, he waited. And if a man spoke too boldly, if a family name grew too luminous, the curtain would fall and the victim would vanish, sometimes to exile, often to death, always to silence. The empire had traded one god for a ghost. But Rome, that brilliant, brutal machine, adapted. The senators, ever pragmatic, learned the new rules. Loyalty meant survival, deference meant peace, and silence, most of all, meant life. They praised Tiberius's restraint, his modesty, his wisdom. Even as old alliances were dismantled and old names erased from marble and memory, they applauded. For to oppose Tiberius was to enter a room with no doors. And so the empire shifted. No longer a stage for charismatic leadership, it became a maze of fear and second meanings. The golden optimism of Augustus faded into the cold steel of imperial paranoia. Statues still gleamed, banners still fluttered, but behind every smile in the Senate there was calculation. Behind every cheer in the street there was doubt, behind every whisper a listener. Rome had its new emperor, but what it did not have, what it never truly received, was faith in him. Tiberius knew this. He felt it in the way the people avoided his eyes, in the way the Senate hesitated when speaking his name, in the way poets wrote of shadows wearing crowns, and so he withdrew even further. Let others perform, let others speak. He would rule by absence, by echo, by fear. He had been forced to the throne not with love, but with necessity. And now he would rule not with hope, but with control. If Tiberius was the shadow on the throne, then Lucius Aelius Sejanus was the whisper that grew into a scream. At first, he was just another soldier, commander of the Praetorian Guard, appointed not out of love or admiration, but because he was competent, quiet, and useful. But in the empty space where Tiberius should have ruled with fire, Sejanus poured oil. In the absence of charisma, he offered order, and in a court where everyone feared speaking too loudly, he built a kingdom on silence. He did not seize power with swords, he did it with smiles. Sejanus began by reshaping the very tools of imperial control. The Praetorian Guard, once scattered across Rome in different barracks, was consolidated into a single fortified camp just outside the city, not to protect the emperor, but to remind the Senate that the emperor was always protected. And Tiberius, so averse to crowds and ceremonies, seemed to appreciate this quiet efficiency. He rewarded Sejanus with access, with praise, and most of all, with trust. That trust, over time, became absolute. The palace changed. Letters from provinces went through Sejanus. Appointments, promotions, even executions, all now bore the faint mark of his approval. He smiled at senators. He dined with generals. He whispered into the ears of the emperor. And behind every pleasant nod was a ledger of names, being sorted into columns, those who would survive and those who would not. It was in this growing climate of calculated control that the first accusations began. Someone had insulted the emperor's mother. Another had toasted the republic. A poem had been written that could be interpreted, if one squinted hard enough, as disloyal. Each incident, insignificant alone, was presented to Tiberius with grave solemnity. And he listened. And he agreed. And the accused were put on trial or exiled, or ordered to fall on their own swords. At first the Senate complied reluctantly, muttering that it was only a few extremists. But as the accusations widened, as senators watched their colleagues vanish from dinner tables and reappear only as names carved on tombs, the mood shifted. Fear replaced skepticism. Loyalty became a survival tactic, and the quiet man behind the emperor began to wield power greater than any consul. In 23 CE, Rome trembled as Drusus, Tiberius's only son, died suddenly. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, it was Sejanus. Historians like Tacitus later alleged that Sejanus, hungry for the throne, had seduced Drusus's wife and convinced her to poison her husband. Whether true or not, the death left a vacuum. Tiberius, who had never loved easily, now lost the only blood tie he had left. And Sejanus, patient and opportunistic, moved quickly into that void. He requested to marry into the imperial family. He asked to be seen not just as a servant, but as a son-in-law. Tiberius hesitated, but Rome noticed. And then, in 26 CE, Tiberius disappeared. He left the city, not in secret, but without explanation. He boarded a ship, sailed across the sea, and settled on the cliffs of Capri, where sea caves whispered secrets and the air was too salty for conspiracies. From there he governed remotely, sending letters, reading reports, but never returning. He claimed he was old, he claimed he needed rest, but Rome understood something had broken, and into that vacuum Sejanus stepped fully. He now controlled the guard, the letters, the courts, the palace. When senators received invitations to dine, they no longer looked for the imperial seal, they looked for Sejanus's handwriting. When trials were announced, it was his voice they heard read the charges, and when people vanished, they no longer asked why, only when it would be their turn. By this point the Rome of Augustus, the Rome of calculated moderation and engineered optimism, was gone. In its place stood a city of locked doors, shuttered windows, and a senate that bowed not to law or principle, but to all fear. Tiberius, perched above the sea, watched it all. He read the names, he counted the disappearances, and he allowed it. Whether out of exhaustion, grief, trust, or something far darker, he gave Sejanus permission to turn Rome into a stage for terror. And while the city slept under the weight of its own silence, the man who once fought in Germania now ruled only in shadows, letting someone else hold the blade. By 26 CE, the man who ruled the greatest empire on earth vanished from its heart without warning, retreating not under threat of rebellion or foreign invasion, but under the unbearable weight of his own disgust. With Rome, with his court, and perhaps most of all, with himself. Tiberius did not abdicate. He did not announce his departure with fanfare or apology. He simply left. Boarding a ship with a quiet entourage and a chest of scrolls, he crossed the Tyrrhenian Sea and ascended the jagged cliffs of Capri, an island that shimmered in sunlight like a crown of stone, where the sky met the sea in endless blue and the winds carried no whispers of senators or betrayal. It was here, in isolation, that the emperor decided to rule not from palaces filled with politics, but from the edge of the world, surrounded by waves, silence, and shadows. Capri, once a retreat for Augustus, became something darker under Tiberius. He constructed 12 villas, not for governance, not for guests, not even for display, but for indulgence, each one more secluded and decadent than the last. There were gardens trimmed with precision, baths perfumed with foreign oils, and chambers whose purposes were whispered about but never officially recorded. Marble stairways led to nowhere, rooms opened into caves, and guards were stationed not to protect the emperor from enemies, but to keep others from escaping what Capri would become. The island was not a retirement. It was a transformation. Far from the Senate's eyes, Tiberius let go of restraint, no longer bound by the optics of Roman decorum or the illusion of a republican virtue. The man who once avoided crowds now surrounded himself with servants who did not speak unless spoken to, with slaves imported not for labour but for pleasure, and with attendants so thoroughly trained in obedience that their humanity seemed erased by routine. According to Suetonius, whose 12 Caesars records the empire's grotesque understated with both fascination and revulsion, Tiberius indulged in a world of such depravity that even the word excess fails to contain it. He allegedly trained naked youths to swim between his legs, calling them his little fishes, and outfitted chambers with tools not of torture, but of perversion, where acts were performed not just in secrecy, but in ritual. The villas of Capri were not merely architectural marvels, they were stage sets for appetites ungoverned by law, morality, or consequence. Cassius Dio, more restrained but no less damning, speaks of men and boys used until they could no longer speak of what they endured. Some were flung from cliffs into the sea when they no longer pleased. Others, it is said, vanished into the caves, their names never recorded, their bodies never recovered. And yet all of it existed in a fog of ambiguity. No formal charges were ever brought. No records from Tiberius himself survive. The line between exaggeration and truth remains unclear, but the fact that such horrors were even whispered, and that the whispers persisted for centuries, tells us more about the atmosphere of fear and secrecy than any surviving edict could. Because by then fear had become imperial policy. Back in Rome, Sejanus ruled in the emperor's name, but the emperor was not absent. From his marble table atop the cliffs, Tiberius read letters, signed death warrants, and studied reports of treason trials with a calm, dispassionate eye. He corresponded with governors. He dictated policies, but he never returned to the city, never walked its stones again, never addressed its people in person. He had abandoned Rome, and in doing so remade it. Capri became more than a place. It became a myth. Mothers told their children not to speak the emperor's name near the sea. Senators refused to travel west without good reason. Ambassadors left the island shaken, unable to speak of what they had seen. And Rome, like a child exiled from its parent, pretended to govern itself, even as the shadow of Capri grew longer across every courtroom, every whisper, every act of submission. Tiberius, once reluctant, once obedient, had become something else entirely. No longer a son, no longer a general, no longer even a ruler in the conventional sense. He was now a presence, remote, unchallenged and untouchable. And as Rome turned into a city of locked doors and hushed voices, Capri stood quiet above the waves, its cliffs soaked in salt and secrets. There, the emperor sat, not to rest, but to dissolve himself into legend. One act of indulgence, one order of execution, one silent scream at a time. What happened on Capri did not stay on Capri, it travelled, not through formal edicts or imperial decrees, but through glances, through rumours carried by wind, through sailors who refused to look at the island as they passed, through slaves who arrived full of fear and departed in silence, if they departed at all. In Rome they spoke of the grottos, of marble corridors beneath the earth, of pools that shimmered not with sunlight but with something colder, something that clung to skin and breath and memory. But it was not until Suetonius, writing decades later in the 12 Caesars, committed the whispers to parchment, that the darkness of Capri took shape in words that still burn the tongue. He wrote of children, not soldiers, not conspirators, not reals, children. Boys, some no older than 10, were taken from across the empire, from noble houses eager to curry favour, from slave markets where beauty outweighed strength, from orphanages where no one would ask questions. They were brought to Capri not as students, not as pages, not even as servants, but as offerings. They were bathed in perfumed water, clothed in silk tunics sewn with golden thread, and trained with the same discipline once reserved for Rome's legions, to perform acts of submission, humiliation, and unspeakable pleasure. They were called Tiberius's playthings, And if the tales are to be believed, he did not merely use them, he transformed them into instruments of ritual, of power, of spectacle cloaked in secrecy. There were stories of boys licking the emperor's fingers at dinner, of girls forced into imitation of gods and animals, of infants used in acts so depraved that even Suetonius, no stranger to imperial scandal, wrote only in suggestion, leaving the reader to complete the horror. Some historians, centuries later, questioned the veracity of these claims. Perhaps Suetonius, with his love for scandal and his disdain for Tiberius, embellished the grotesque. Perhaps the tales were exaggerated by enemies of the Julio-Claudian line. Perhaps, they say, such allegations served political ends, serving to justify the crimes of those who came after. But others argue if even a fraction is true, it is enough, because Charlotte's imperial, absolute surveillance surrounded Capri. No investigation was ever opened, no court ever questioned the disappearances, no senator dared confront the emperor. And in an empire where the smallest offence could earn death, the fact that no one dared speak of the children is itself an indictment more damning than any surviving document. And there were so many children. They came by boat, faces wide with awe, eyes catching the shimmer of white marble palaces rising from the cliffside, unaware that behind each column stood a hunger that did not age. Some stayed for days, some vanished within hours, some, it is said, were disposed of when they began to weep, a sound that displeased the emperor. Cassius Dio writes in darker tones that Tiberius used the mute and the broken, that he selected those least able to report what was done to them, and that when he tired of their company, they were cast from cliffs into the sea, their bodies dashed on the rocks, their names unspoken, their souls unremembered. And yet the island remained beautiful. The birds still sang, the sea still sparkled, the villas still gleamed with imported marble and soft velvet drapes. Guests still arrived, carefully chosen, carefully watched. And each time they returned, they said little. Perhaps they were bribed, perhaps they were afraid, or perhaps they understood that Capri was no longer a place. It was a secret, shared by emperors and devoured by history. Rome, for its part, looked away. The Senate, increasingly distant from the emperor, filled its hours with flattery and avoidance. The citizens, weary from trials and treason, whispered the name Tiberius like one whispers a disease, with fear, with fatigue, or with resignation. And the guards stationed at Capri's docks kept no records, asked no questions, and watched with eyes trained not to feel. The children who went to Capri did not return with tales. They returned in nightmares, in rumours, in vague accounts passed from slave to servant to writer. Most didn't return at all, and still, the empire bowed. Because when the one holding the crown demands silence, silence becomes law, and when that silence devours the innocent, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes rot beneath marble, it becomes ghosts beneath waves, it becomes history's cruelest truth, that power, left unchecked, will always feast on those who cannot scream. The only thing more dangerous than a tyrant in Rome was a tyrant who had been betrayed. In 31 CE, the man who had become the second most powerful figure in the empire, Lucius alias Sejanus, fell from power so suddenly, so violently, and so completely that even the cold stone statues in the Senate seemed to shiver. One morning he was princeps in all but name. That night he was shackled and strangled. His body, torn from dignity, was left for dogs in the forum. No funeral, no defence, no trial, just an imperial letter, delivered from Capri, read aloud in trembling voices by a senate that now understood what it meant to live in a world where proximity to power offered no shield, only the illusion of safety before the sword fell. Tiberius had trusted Sejanus, or pretended to, or allowed him to rise so high that his fall would be instructional. No one knew for certain, no one dared ask. But after Sejanus was gone, the emperor did not celebrate, he did not restore order, he did not return to Rome. Instead, he unleashed something darker, not chaos, but a methodical, blood-soaked accounting. The purge began quietly, one senator, then another, then a cousin, then a widow, then a son. Whispers became accusations, accusations became trials. Trials became death sentences passed in secret chambers or sealed scrolls dispatched from Capri, signed with a hand that trembled not with guilt, but with the cold delight of remembered betrayal. Anyone who had once spoken with Sejanus, dined with him, served in his campaigns, or failed to cheer loudly enough at his fall, all were suspect. The prison cells overflowed. The Tullianum choked with bodies. Executions were scheduled in batches, and each morning in Rome arrived with fewer names in the register and more ashes in the air. The imperial system that Augustus had built, balanced carefully on image, consent, and illusion, had been replaced with something far simpler: fear as governance, terror as language, death as policy. And Capri, perched high above the sea like a vulture watching its prey, became the command centre of a government whose primary function was not administration, nor diplomacy, nor justice, but elimination. Tiberius read everything: letters, reports, confessions, accusations. He read them not as burdens, but as nourishment, feeding a mind that had once been filled with maps and battle plans and now obsessed over names, motives, secrets, and betrayals that may or may not have ever existed. And what he could not verify he punished anyway, because in an empire ruled by paranoia, doubt itself was enough to destroy. Wives accused their husbands to spare themselves, children informed on fathers, friends turned on one another in the hope that betrayal would buy time. The Senate, no longer a deliberative body, became a theatre of survival, a place where tears flowed more freely than laws, where grovelling was safer than silence, and where every speech began not with arguments, but with ritual praise of the emperor's mercy. But mercy had fled the empire long ago. Rome was no longer a city. It was a courtroom where the verdict had already been written. Even the exiled were not safe. Tiberius sent agents to islands and villages across the empire, to poison wells, to arrange accidents, to strangle the forgotten at night in villas no longer visited by friends. No corner of the map was beyond reach. No exile was beyond suspicion. No death was beyond ordering. And still, Tiberius did not return. He remained on Capra, watching, listening, writing. Some days he summoned astrologers, other days he invited philosophers, not to debate ideas, but to interrogate truth. He asked about fate, about punishment, about the soul, and when their answers failed to please, they too were sent away, never to be seen again. The emperor had become an instrument of retribution, not divine, not lawful, not even ideological, but personal. Every betrayal etched into his memory now demanded blood. Every name that once whispered doubt now echoed in his ears. Every sleepless night, every humiliation, every scar repaid one by one with silence and steel. And Rome, once the heart of a republic, once the jewel of a civilizing empire, once the beacon of law, now cowered under a ruler who no longer ruled, but hunted. He no longer needed to sit on the throne, he had become the throne, and in the empire of Tiberius, it was not obedience that guaranteed safety, it was invisibility. By the early 30s CE, Rome had grown quieter than it had ever been, not in sound, but in soul. The streets were still filled with the clatter of carts and the cries of vendors, the Senate still convened, temples still burned incense, gladiators still spilled blood in the Colosseum. But beneath the ordinary, a thick, choking silence had wrapped itself around the empire like a fog no sun could pierce. It was not peace, it was not stability, it was the terror of a people too frightened to exhale. No one spoke freely, no one trusted their neighbour, no one knew which word, which glance, which dinner conversation might find its way to Capri, where an old man, wrapped in purple and surrounded by mirrors and masks, would read it with interest, mark a name in red, and ensure that by nightfall that name would no longer be spoken. The people of Rome learned to live without language. Poets stopped writing satire, philosophers stopped hosting debates. Playwrights edited their lines to please not the audience but the censors. Even the most loyal citizens walked with their eyes lowered, careful not to seem curious, careful not to appear ambitious, careful not to display anything that resembled thought. Because thought under Tiberius had become treason. Informants flourished, brothers turned in brothers, freedmen accused their masters, senators offered up confessions before they were even charged, hoping that early compliance would buy leniency, though more often it brought only a quicker death. The prisons, overcrowded and festering, became echo chambers of despair, where the condemned repeated one question over and over: what did I say? What did I do? What did I fail to hide? There were no answers. Only silence. Even the stars, once objects of beauty and prophecy, became subjects of fear. An astrologer's prediction could be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. A dream recounted too honestly could be called divine rebellion. The emperor, perched on his cliffside throne in Capri, was said to consult the heavens, but punish those who dared do the same. A single verse, "O Rome, how you kneel," carved anonymously into a wall near the Forum, was enough to see 10 men tortured, none of whom ever confessed. And still, no one protested, because by now the empire had learned. The greatest protection against suspicion was to become no one at all. Mothers taught their children to recite only imperial praises. Fathers warned sons not to excel too visibly. Daughters learned to weep without sound. And the city, once the engine of the world's imagination, dulled itself into survival, one bowed head at a time. From his palace on Capri, Tiberius read reports daily, not of war or famines or infrastructure, but of feelings, of aggressions, of loyalties. He read of who hesitated before applauding in the Senate. He read of a noblewoman who left a feast early. He read of a general whose troops shouted his name too loudly in Gaul. He read of slaves who dreamt of liberty, of magistrates who missed meetings, of citizens who looked too long at statues of Augustus. And each report, no matter how minor, was treated as potential rot, not to be investigated, but to be removed before it spread. It is said that by this point, Tiberius had memorized 1,000 names, names of the executed, the exiled, the erased, and that each night he would walk through his memory palace of shadows, whispering those names aloud before sleep, not with regret, but with satisfaction, not because he hated them, but because he believed they had failed him. That was the core of the empire's new logic, that the people existed not to love the emperor nor serve him, but to not betray him. And betrayal was anything he feared, which meant betrayal was everything. A poet who survived this era, writing decades later, summarized it with trembling ink. The walls have ears, the sea has informants, even the gods report to Caesar. That was the Rome of Tiberius. A city where no one cheered anymore, not at parades, not at births, not even at weddings. A capital where applause had become a weapon, where silence was self-defense, and where the most desired luxury was to be forgotten. This was no longer the empire of Augustus, no longer a place of laws, nor of dreams. It was a nation that had stopped breathing, and no one dared ask when or if it would ever inhale again. It was spring in 37 CE when the silence finally broke, not with war, not with revolt, not even with resistance, but with a breath, one final ragged exhale, somewhere behind the ivory walls of a villa in southern Italy, where the emperor lay dying beneath silk sheets that smelled not of incense or victory, but of rot and old wine. Tiberius had ruled Rome for nearly a quarter of a century, longer than most remembered. He had outlived Augustus's heirs, outlasted his enemies, and outmaneuvered every Senate faction that once dreamed of restoring the Republic. But even shadows, given enough time, fade. His death, like his reign, came cloaked in uncertainty. Some said it was natural, the slow collapse of a body exhausted by age and corrosion. Others said it was hastened by poison slipped into his wine, or by suffocation administered by his successor, Caligula, whose ambitions had outgrown patience. Suetonius tells the story with a cruel theatricality, that Tiberius stopped breathing, that doctors declared him dead, that mourners were summoned and preparations begun, and then, as Caligula was accepting congratulations, a cough erupted from the corpse. Eyes opened, fingers as twitched. The emperor lived, but not for long. According to the tale, Macro, the Praetorian prefect who had once helped eliminate Sejanus and now hoped to shape Caligula's reign, ordered the suffocation himself. A pillow, a command, and witnesses, and then true death. The truth, as with so much of Tiberius, remains buried in uncertainty, tangled in second-hand accounts, contradictions, and the fog of imperial myth-making. But what is certain is this: there was no mourning. Rome, when informed, did not grieve. There were no public displays of sorrow, no monuments commissioned in haste, no crowds lining the streets in reverence, only a collective exhale, the kind a city takes when a weight has been lifted, even if no one dares name the weight aloud. His body was returned to Rome. It travelled by ship shrouded in imperial cloth, escorted not by weeping senators or faithful generals, but by officials carrying out orders, their eyes forward, their hands steady, their mouths closed. There was no eruption of grief upon arrival, no wails, no laments, just the creaking of the funeral cart as it passed over cobblestones. The Senate convened not to honour his legacy, but to array it. His statues were pulled down quietly, his name was scratched from dedications, his portraits were removed from family shrines. It was not an official damnatio memoriae, not the full legal erasure reserved for the worst of Rome's disgraced, but it was a social one, a cultural one, a remembering by forgetting. They did not want to immortalize his cruelty. They did not want to debate his crimes. They wanted him gone, not just from power, but from memory. The people whispered. They whispered about the children who vanished on Capri, about the marble villas and their locked doors, about the screams that had echoed across the cliffs during windless nights, about the senators who smiled one morning and were missing the next, about the families who never received bodies, only silence, about the laws that were never laws, only orders carried by men in boots. They whispered, and then they moved on. Caligula, young and handsome, stepped into power with applause. He offered festivals, games, and clemency. He wept at Augustus's tomb. He proclaimed a new era, and the people had Vesten for joy, braced it blindly, forgetting perhaps too quickly that empires do not change their nature simply because a new face wears the crown. But Tiberius was not gone, not really. His legacy lived on, not in temples or triumphs, but in fear, in the systems he built, in the culture of silence he enforced, in the way senators still paused before speaking, calculating every word, in the way servants still flinched at footsteps, in the way the people still measured loyalty not by law but by survival. He had ruled for 23 years, and in those years he had taught Rome that power need not speak, that power, when wielded with enough calculation, could become indistinguishable from fate itself. He had died alone, unloved, unwept, but not undone, because while his name may have faded from marble, the fear remained etched in every Roman's posture, a lesson so deeply learned that even death could not unteach it. And Capri remained. The waves still crashed against the cliffs. The villas still stood, empty, echoing. And when the wind blew just right, some said you could still hear laughter, or crying, or something between. But no one sailed there any more, not without reason, not without sore silence. Tiberius left no golden age, no reform that bore his name, no law that reshaped Roman justice, no great monument to awe the centuries, no children to carry his legacy, only ash, and a chill that lingered in the spaces where trust had once lived. He ruled longer than Julius Caesar, longer than Nero, longer even than Hadrian would. And yet, when you ask people to name the emperors of Rome, Tiberius seldom emerges first. He is the one history remembers with discomfort. Not because he was forgotten, but because remembering him feels like reopening a wound that never healed. He was not loved. He was not feared like a god. He was not admired like a hero. He was endured. And when he died, the empire did not collapse. It kept breathing, slowly, carefully, cautiously. But it had changed. The Senate learned that applause could be fatal. Citizens learned that quietness was currency. And Rome itself learned that tyranny did not require spectacle. It only required endurance and a ruler who could outlive the world's ability to protest. Tiberius weaponized absence. He ruled not through oratory, but through retreat. Not through spectacle, but through the slow erosion of what made Rome Roman. He left behind no statues of hope, only ruins of fear. He taught the empire how to whisper, how to betray, how to survive by disappearing. And Capri, his kingdom of silence and shadows, remained the symbol of that transformation. It was not a palace. It was a ritual, a place where names were erased, where boys were born, where crimes were never spoken aloud because to name them was to admit that they had happened. And so we return to the question, what remains of a ruler who silences the world around him? His coins are gone, his temples forgotten, his name half erased. But his echo, it lives. It lives in every government that places secrecy above justice, in every system that praises silence over truth, in every ruler who understands that to be feared quietly is more effective than to be loved loudly, in every citizen who learns to hold their tongue, not because they lack words, but because they have learned that words can bleed. Tiberius is not gone. He lives in shadows, in cold offices, in prison cells, in censored books, in unmarked graves, in the memory of every empire that traded law for loyalty and forgot that power, once fed by fear, never stops eating. As for us, the descendants of that Roman legacy, we must ask ourselves a harder question. When fear becomes the language of rule, when silence becomes the only form of safety, when cruelty is whispered into policy, and pleasure becomes indistinguishable from violence, are we still living in history, or are we simply repeating it, one unspoken truth at a time? And that is the shadowed story of Emperor Tiberius, the man who inherited an empire and drowned it in whispers. If you believe that history must be remembered, even when it hurts, subscribe, because silence should never win, not again, not ever.